In the rolling hills of Virginia, the year was 1834. The tobacco fields stretched wide, the air thick with summer humidity, and life in the small town of Lemont seemed predictable. People knew their neighbors. Doors were left unlatched. Nights were quiet, save for the hum of cicadas. But beneath that stillness, something was stirring, and in the shadows of one family's home, the town's illusion of safety was about to collapse. The Sullivans were not newcomers. Their name had lingered in Virginia since the Revolution. Thomas Sullivan, the father, was known as a stern, God-fearing man who rarely smiled. His wife Eleanor carried herself with the sharp dignity of an old matriarch. Together they raised 7 children in a sprawling farmhouse that stood on the edge of Learmont's woods. To outsiders, they were respectable. Church every Sunday, their crops in neat rows. Their children dressed properly in hand-sewn clothes. If they were quiet, if their curtains were always drawn, well, that was their way. But late at night, neighbors whispered of lights burning in the Sullivan cellar. Strange chanting, faint but steady, carried on the wind. A rhythm, not drunken singing, not prayer, but something in between. And sometimes, just before dawn, the town's children swore they saw the Sullivan brood walking the fields barefoot, their eyes pale, their lips moving silently in unison. It started small. A farmhand's boy, gone after feeding chickens. Then a merchant's daughter, vanishing on her way to fetch water. At first, it was explained away. Wolves, accidents, runaways. Virginia was still wild country. Tragedies happened. But then there were more. A blacksmith's apprentice, a miller's twins, a seamstress's niece. By midsummer, the count had reached 12, and the town, every house in Lemont had a cellar. But the Sullivan cellar was different. Neighbors swore they had never once seen its heavy oak door opened. Not during harvest, not during storms, not even when other families sought refuge underground. And yet, at night, the faintest flicker of lantern glow could be seen through its cracks. And the sound that no one wanted to admit they heard. A low hum, sometimes laughter, sometimes weeping, always a rhythm, as if 100 feet tapped against the dirt floor, in perfect unison. Before we go further, let me ask you, where in the world are you watching from tonight? Because this story, the story of the Sullivan basement, will test every boundary between history and nightmare. And I promise you, by the end, you will not look at your own cellar the same way again. You are new to Cold Mysteries? Subscribe now. We travel into the shadows of history each week, unearthing what was never meant to be remembered. Now, back to Virginia. 1834, to the whispers that would soon become screams. One evening, a traveling preacher stopped in Lemont. His sermons thundered fire and brimstone, but it was what he said over supper that silenced the room. He had passed by the Sullivan farmhouse, and in the fading light he claimed he saw children, dozens of them, standing in the yard. But not the Sullivan children. These were faces unfamiliar to the town. Thin, hollow-eyed, their clothes ragged, their mouths moving silently, as if repeating words only they could hear. When the preacher looked again, the yard was empty. Only the Sullivans stood there, smiling faintly in the dusk. After that night, the town could no longer pretend. Doors were locked. Mothers clutched their children closer. Men carried rifles to market. And still, the disappearances continued. By autumn, the number was no longer 12. It was 24. And the whispers had turned into one chilling phrase, spoken in the hush of candlelight. Whatever the Sullivans keep in that basement, it is not grain. By the fall of 1834, Lemont was no longer the peaceful town it once claimed to be. A quiet war of suspicion had begun, and all roads led to one house. The Sullivan home stood at the edge of the woods, its shutters nailed tight, its fields strangely underworked. But it wasn't the crops or even the family that drew eyes. It was the door that led down into the earth. The door that no one in town had ever seen opened. At first it was mothers who kept vigil. They gathered near wells or at fences, glancing toward the farmhouse. Then came the men, hunters, blacksmiths, farmers, who took turns lingering near the woods at night. rifles in hand, daring each other to catch a glimpse. They saw shadows through the curtains. They heard faint voices that rose and fell like chanting, and they noticed something stranger still. The Sullivan children, all 7 of them, often walked in circles around the house just before midnight, barefoot, pale, whispering to themselves, as if rehearsing some silent ritual. One farmer swore he saw the children pause in unison, tilt their heads back, and laugh at the sky. No sound reached him, only the movement of their mouths, stretched wide in the darkness. Lemont's schoolmaster, a meticulous man named William Hart, kept careful records of every child in the district. In September, he began cross-checking his attendance lists with the town's church records. What he discovered chilled him. Several children who had gone missing, 12 by his count, had been marked absent in his ledger for weeks. But strangely, he noticed new marks, faint pencil entries, of children he had never seen in his schoolroom at all. Names no family in Lemont could claim. Names that seemed invented. And yet, the handwriting was not his. Someone had touched his ledger. Someone who, one night in October, a hunter named Elias Grant took it upon himself to stand guard near the Sullivan farm. He was a tall man, known for courage and stubbornness. He waited by the tree line, musket at his side, and listened. At first only silence. Then the wind carried it, a low vibration like a hum rising from the earth itself. Elias swore later that it was not just chanting. It was children's voices, dozens of them layered, weaving together into one rhythm that seemed to rise and fall like the breathing of some monstrous creature. And then he saw light, a faint glow at the edges of the cellar door. It pulsed, once, twice like a heartbeat, before vanishing. Elias did not fire his gun. He did not shout. He turned and walked back to town, pale as the moon, his lips whispering the same phrase over and over. There are too many in that place. The town could ignore it no longer. After another disappearance, this time a judge's nephew, a small group of men decided to act. Late one evening, 6 of them walked the dirt path to the Sullivan home. They carried lanterns, ropes, and axes. Their plan was simple: knock, demand entry, and if refused, break through the cellar door. But when they arrived, the house was utterly still. The lanterns inside were extinguished. No shadows moved. Even the fields, usually alive with crickets, seemed muted. Gathering courage, one man stepped forward and pressed his ear against the heavy oak door of the cellar. What he heard froze him where he stood. It was not the sound of prayers. It was not the sound of weeping. It was the sound of laughter. Dozens of children's voices all laughing in unison. And then the townsfolk had whispered long enough. The cellar was no longer a secret, but an open wound festering at the center of Learmont. And in the autumn of 1834, they finally confronted the family that guarded it. The decision came not in the courthouse, nor the judge's chambers, but in the town church. Men and women gathered after Sunday service, their voices hushed, their eyes darting toward the Sullivan pew. That morning, the family had filed in as always. Thomas, Eleanor, and the 7 children, all dressed in perfect order. They did not sing. They did not bow their heads. They sat unnervingly still, their pale faces turned toward the pulpit. When the service ended, the preacher, urged on by the congregation's fearful eyes, asked the family to remain. And for the first time, the Sullivans did not leave. They waited, motionless, as if expecting what would come next. William Hart, the schoolmaster, stepped forward first. His voice trembled, but his words were firm. "Where are they?" he asked. "The missing children. Tell us." Thomas Sullivan rose slowly, his face unreadable. He clasped his hands behind his back and answered in a voice calm enough to silence the church. "They are not missing," he said. "They have found where they belong." A murmur spread through the crowd, fear rippling across familiar faces. Another man shouted, "Then bring them out! Let us see them." Eleanor Sullivan turned her head toward the voice, her lips curving into the faintest of smiles. As the adults argued, the 7 Sullivan children began to hum. Soft at first, almost like a hymn, their voices wove together in a strange harmony. The melody was simple, repetitive, but wrong. The sound seemed to vibrate in the chest, pulling at the rhythm of the listener's own breath. Some swore later that the candles in the church flickered in time with the hum. One woman clapped her hands over her ears. Another fainted. The preacher, sweating, banged his fist against the pulpit. "Enough!" he roared. The children stopped, but their pale eyes never blinked. Finally, Elias Grant, the hunter who had heard the laughter at the cellar, stepped forward. His face was lined with exhaustion, his voice heavy with rage. "What lies beneath your home?" he demanded. "I've heard them. I've heard what no man should hear." "If you do not open that door, then by God we will!" Thomas Sullivan's eyes fixed on him. For the first time his calm mask cracked into something sharper. His words came slow, deliberate, and chilling. "You will not open it. You cannot. The children are not kept there. They are becoming there." The phrase struck the congregation with a confusion more terrifying than denial. Becoming what? Becoming how? The preacher, trembling but resolute, tried to anchor the moment. He stepped toward the family, Bible in hand. "You speak in riddles, Thomas? This town demands truth. By the Lord above, I order you, open the cellar and prove you are not what they say." Eleanor Sullivan tilted her head, almost mockingly, and whispered loud enough for all to hear, "It is not locked." That night the debate raged until dawn. Some wanted to storm the house, tear down the door, and drag the truth into daylight. Others feared what might be found. Not wolves, not bandits, but something older, something that words could not contain. But one fact was undeniable. If the door was not locked, then the Sullivans were not guarding it. By late October, the air in Learmont had turned brittle and cold. The harvest left to rot in the fields. But no one spoke of crops anymore. They spoke only of the Sullivan basement. And on a night of silence so deep it felt staged, a dozen townsfolk took their lanterns, their axes and their courage, and walked to the farmhouse. The house looked deserted. No smoke from the chimney, no light in the windows, no voices within. But the door was unlocked, just as Eleanor Sullivan had promised. Inside, dust clung to every surface. Chairs were neatly arranged, food still set on the table, as if the family had simply vanished mid-meal. But the plates were spotless, untouched, though the candles had burned down to blackened stubs. The children's shoes were lined up neatly by the hearth, too neatly, as if they had been placed there in ceremony, not in use. And there, at the far end of the room, half hidden beneath a rug, lay the cellar door. When they pulled back the rug, the first sound reached them, a faint, almost playful tapping, like fingernails drumming on wood. It came in bursts. Pause, tap, tap, tap. Pause, tap, tap, tap. The men froze. The women clutched at their shawls. And then William Hart whispered, "It's coming from beneath." The tapping stopped, as if the cellar itself had heard. The door was heavy oak, reinforced with iron bands. But there was no lock, only a long iron handle that had been worn smooth by years of use. Elias Grant gripped the handle first. His knuckles whitened, his jaw tightened. With one hard pull, the door creaked open, releasing a draft of air so cold and sour it made the lantern flames sputter. The smell that rose from below. There, stacked neatly in rows against the wall, sat dolls. Dozens of them, handmade from rags, straw, and carved wood. Each doll bore a crude face, stitched with black thread, but their bodies were marked with the same strange symbols carved into the walls. There were exactly as many dolls as there were missing children. The laughter grew louder, though no children were in sight. It seemed to seep from the walls themselves. One man dropped his lantern. The flames sputtered and died, leaving half the group in sudden darkness. The laughter stopped. At the far end of the basement, half hidden behind stacked crates, was another door, smaller, narrower, and built not of wood but of iron. Unlike the first, this one was locked, a heavy padlock rusted but unbroken. Scratched into the metal deep enough to cut skin if touched were words in a trembling, uneven hand. "Do not open." The group stared at the warning, their fear choking them into silence. Finally, Elias Grant whispered the words none wanted to hear. If we've come this far, we must see. And so in the cold dark of that October night, 12 lanterns gathered around the final door, the door that would decide whether Lemont's darkest rumors were superstition or something far worse. The first door had been easy. It was meant to be opened. But this second door, buried deep beneath the Sullivan farmhouse, was not meant to yield. And yet, the townsfolk, lanterns trembling in their hands, could not turn back now. Elias Grant swung the butt of his axe against the rusted padlock. Once, twice, 3 times. The clang echoed in the cellar like church bells rung underground. On the 4th strike, the lock shattered. The sound of it hitting the dirt floor was drowned out by something else, a deep groan from behind the door. Not human, not animal, something in between. The women shrieked, the men froze. But the iron door now hung loose, ready to swing open. When they pulled it ajar, a blast of air struck them, colder than any October night, colder than winter's bite. Their lantern flames bent away as though repelled. And then came the smell, not rot, not soil, but something acrid, chemical, like burned metal mixed with sickness. Through the crack, their lantern light revealed nothing, just a black corridor stretching beyond sight, cut into stone older than the house above. The laughter began again, not close this time, but distant, multiplied, echoing in endless layers. Lanterns lifted, they stepped forward. The passage sloped downward, deeper into the earth. Walls dripped with moisture. The markings grew stranger, spirals, jagged lines, shapes that seemed to shift in the flickering light. The corridor twisted, then widened into a chamber. At its center stood a circle of stones, blackened as though scorched by fire. Around them lay small objects, shoes, ribbons, wooden toys, each carefully placed, not discarded. And at the very edge of the circle, in perfect rows, knelt the missing children, 47 in all. Their faces pale, their eyes hollow, their mouths slightly open as if caught mid-breath. They did not move. They did not blink. One of the women gasped and rushed forward, but Elias caught her arm. "Wait!" Because, though their faces were familiar, something was wrong, terribly wrong. The children's eyes reflected lantern light in unnatural ways, not like pupils but like glass. Their skin carried a faint grey sheen, like stone polished by years. And worst of all, their lips curled into faint, identical smiles. The townsfolk whispered their names, called for them, pleaded, hunhe, but none responded. Instead, all 47 heads turned at once toward the intruders. The movement was too precise, too synchronized. The lantern flames guttered violently. Then, from beyond the circle of children, a voice rose, smooth, calm, almost soothing. "You should not have come." The lanterns caught a figure stepping into view. Eleanor Sullivan. Her gown trailed in the dirt, her hands clasped neatly in front of her. Her face bore no malice, only serenity, as though she were presiding over a prayer service. Beside her, the 7 Sullivan children emerged, humming the same eerie tune heard in the church. The melody reverberated against the chamber walls, unsettlingly harmonious. Thomas Sullivan followed last. His eyes glinted in the lantern glow, calm as ever. They had come seeking answers. What they found was a congregation, not of worshippers, but of something far older, far colder than faith itself. Elias Grant stepped forward, his axe raised, his breath steaming in the lantern light. "Release them," he demanded, his voice echoing in the stone chamber. "Whatever you've done, undo it now." But Thomas Sullivan only smiled. "You cannot release what has already been bound." The circle of 47 children moved closer, their steps synchronized, their faint smiles stretching unnaturally wide. Their eyes caught the lantern light, not eyes, but mirrors reflecting nothing of humanity. Eleanor Sullivan lifted her hands as if conducting. Her voice, soft but commanding, filled the chamber. "They are the chosen, the marked, the eternal." Her 7 children joined her. their humming deepening into a hymn, a sound that wove around the walls, echoing, multiplying, until it seemed as if hundreds were singing. The hymn did not sound mournful or joyful, but steady, unrelenting, like the endless drone of bees. The town preacher, Reverend Alden, fell to his knees, clutching his Bible. His lips moved in frantic prayer, but the words faltered. He looked up at Eleanor, sweat dripping down his face. "You're playing with forces no man can control."
"These are God's children."
Eleanor's gaze settled on him, calm and terrible.
"No," she whispered.
"They are ours." The 47 children stepped forward again. The lanterns flickered, their flames shrinking as if suffocated by invisible hands. One woman in the group, Martha Briggs, broke. She screamed her son's name, shoving past Elias and rushing toward the circle. For a heartbeat, the boy at the front seemed to falter. His head tilted, his smile softened, and for the briefest instant, recognition flashed in his glassy eyes. But then, like a machine resetting, the smile returned. Elias swung his axe, the blade cleaving through the boy's arm. But instead of blood, a dark, tar-like fluid sprayed across the dirt floor. The boy did not cry out. None of them did. Instead, the entire circle tilted their heads at once, watching Elias with those hollow smiles. Then, as one, they stepped forward. The townsfolk stumbled back, pressed against the stone walls, their lanterns flickering wildly. Thomas raised his hand.
Instantly, the children stopped.
Their stillness was worse than their movement. 47 bodies frozen, 47 glassy eyes fixed on their prey. He looked at Elias with almost pity.
"You cannot fight them."
"They are not yours to save. They are beyond the reach of steel or scripture." Reverend Alden's voice cracked. "Then whose reach are they under?" Thomas's smile deepened, but he did not answer. Eleanor's voice dropped to a whisper, but it carried through the chamber like thunder. The living always resist what the earth has already claimed. At her words, the children stepped closer again. Slowly this time, methodical, their bare feet silent. They were no longer rushing, they were cornering. The air grew colder. Breath crystallized in the lantern glow. The hymn swelled louder, as if the walls themselves were singing. Lantern glass shattered.
One flame went out, then another.
The cellar plunged into near darkness, the circle of children glowing faintly as though lit from within. The lanterns were gone, the light was gone, and in the pitch-black silence of the Sullivan cellar, only two things remained. The echo of the hymn and the sound of bare feet moving closer. With each lantern extinguished, the chamber seemed to shrink. The walls closed in, the air grew heavier, and the temperature dropped until the townsfolk could see their breath in the faint glow of dying wicks. The last lantern sputtered, flame trembling desperately, before snapping out. Darkness swallowed them whole. But the children did not disappear. No, their pale faces shone faintly, like chalk figures in a cave. 47 pairs of glassy eyes gleamed in the dark, unblinking, watching. Martha Briggs clutched her wrist, still throbbing from the grip of her own son, and sobbed uncontrollably.
Please let us go." One of the townsmen, Samuel Reeve, couldn't take it anymore.
He bolted for the corridor, scrambling back toward the iron door. He made it 2 steps. The children moved in unison. A boy no older than 8 extended a hand, and Samuel froze mid-stride, his body stiff as wood. His lantern clattered to the ground. Then, with horrifying calm, the boy tilted his head, and Samuel was dragged backward into the circle. The hymn swelled louder. The children closed in around him, their pale hands reaching out, dozens at once. They touched his face, his chest, his arms, and his screams echoed through the chamber as if he were burning alive. When the circle finally broke apart, Samuel Reeve was gone. Not dead, not living, but changed. He stood among them now. His eyes hollow, his smile identical, his skin grey as stone. The townsfolk recoiled in horror. One of their own had been taken. Elias Grant roared with fury, charging into the circle, swinging his axe. His blade cut into two of the children that same black.
Tar-like substance spilling across the stone floor.
But even as they fell, they did not stay down. Their bodies jerked back upright, movements stiff and mechanical, their smiles unbroken. Elias staggered back, realizing his weapon was useless. Eleanor's voice cut through the hymn like a knife. Do not resist. Resistance makes the change.
Painful.
She raised her arms. The 7 Sullivan children lifted theirs in unison. The hymn grew impossibly loud, vibrating in the bones of every living soul present. It was no longer a song, it was a force, pressing down on them, suffocating them. Several fell to their knees, clutching their heads. The walls themselves seemed to hum, dust falling from the ceiling with each pulse. Another townsman, Henry Pike, collapsed to the ground, hands over his ears. His wife tried to drag him up, screaming his name, but it was too late. The children swarmed. Their hands reached for him, pulling him into the... 2 had already fallen. 2 had already joined the circle. And the rest knew, if they did not flee now...
None would leave that cellar alive, digged or human.
Elias Grant, his axe now useless, barked orders to the group.
To the door! Everyone together!
But fear had already splintered their unity. Some clung to each other, sobbing prayers. Others crouched against the walls, paralyzed. The cellar was no longer just a chamber. It was a trap, its walls breathing with the hymn, its stones humming like a living thing.
Dust trickled from the ceiling.
Cracks groaned under invisible pressure. The entire place seemed on the verge of collapse. 3 men bolted first, charging toward the iron door at the end of the narrow corridor. Their lanterns swung wildly, casting jittering beams across stone. But as they reached the door, the hymn shifted. The children's voices deepened in pitch, resonating through the walls. The iron lock rattled, and then slammed shut with a violent clang.
As though an unseen hand had sealed it.
The men shoved, clawed, and battered the door with their shoulders, but it would not give. Behind them, the children advanced, steps perfectly timed, their pale faces eerily calm. From the shadows a voice trembled. One of the Sullivans' own house servants, pale with terror, spoke.
You cannot leave.
Not unless they allow it.
I have seen it before.
The townsfolk turned on him, desperate for answers. What do you mean? Elias shouted. The servants' lips quivered. They feed the circle each year.
Strangers, wanderers, sometimes their own blood.
It never ends.
Once the song begins, the house, it seals itself.
Gasps erupted. Even the preacher faltered, his Bible shaking in his hands.
Then a miracle.
With a screech of rusted metal, the lock on the iron door groaned. The latch lifted on its own, the heavy door creaking open just enough to reveal the snowy night outside. Hope surged through the group.
Run, Elias bellowed.
They pushed, forcing the gap wider. Cold air rushed into the suffocating cellar. Several townsfolk surged forward, squeezing through the opening. Their feet struck snow. Freedom. But then the hymn changed again. The moment they stepped into the snow, their bodies froze. Their screams pierced the night as they were wrenched backward, not by hands, but by the very air itself. The snow outside swirled violently,
forming a funnel that sucked them back toward the door.
They clawed at the earth, leaving bloody streaks in the snow, but it was useless. In an instant they were pulled inside. Their faces twisted in terror until their expressions went blank, and they rose to their feet within the circle. The iron door slammed shut again. The survivors who had not yet tried to flee collapsed in horror, their last fragment of hope extinguished. The 47 children advanced, their steps perfectly timed, bare feet tapping against stone in rhythm with the hymn. Their smiles widened unnaturally, splitting too far across their faces, as though their skin could barely contain what lived inside. They pressed the group tighter and tighter against the wall. Every time one of the living stumbled or faltered, a pale hand reached out to drag them into the circle. The hymn grew louder, vibrating in the bones of everyone left. Stones cracked. Wooden beams above groaned and splintered. Dust fell in heavy sheets. The cellar. They had one choice left.
One gamble against eternity.
To bury the house, to bury the Sullivans, to bury the circle, and maybe, if they were fortunate, themselves. Elias seized a fallen lantern, its glass shattered, its oil spreading across the stone. He dipped the ragged edge of his coat into it, twisting the cloth until it dripped black with fuel. "We burn it," he said. "We collapse it from the inside." Several nodded, hollow-eyed, but the preacher recoiled. To set fire to a house built on sin is one thing. To set fire with children inside, they're not children, Elias growled. Not anymore. For a heartbeat, no one spoke. The truth was unbearable, yet undeniable. The circle sensed their plan. The hymn shifted violently, no longer a lullaby but a furious shriek that cracked the walls and split the ears of the living. Several screamed, blood trickling from their noses. The children surged forward, dozens of them, their pale hands clawing. Their voices layered in 1,000 pitches that did not belong to human throats. Elias swung the flaming rag, striking one across the chest. The child shrieked, not in pain, but in laughter, a piercing cackle that echoed in every corner of the cellar. The flame caught on its gown, but instead of burning, the fire twisted, bending unnaturally, climbing the ceiling instead of the cloth. The cellar groaned. The air itself seemed alive. A beam above split with a crack like thunder. Dust and plaster rained down. The floor lurched, tilting as the foundation shifted. Lanterns fell, their flames licking at dry timbers. Now the fire spread for real, racing across beams, wrapping the cellar in choking smoke. For the first time, the children faltered. Their hymn wavered, their steps broke rhythm. The magic of the circle strained against the chaos.
"They don't like it," someone screamed.
"The fire's breaking it." Then, a door creaked at the far end of the cellar. Through the smoke, Thomas and Eleanor Sullivan descended the stairs, hand in hand, serene as death itself. Their faces were calm, eyes unblinking, as though they had been waiting for this very moment. Eleanor raised her voice, soft but clear over the crackling fire. "You cannot end what was never begun. The circle is older than stone.
Older than us?
We are merely its keepers." Thomas added, his tone almost pitying.
"You think you can burn it?"
"But fire feeds it. Collapse strengthens it. Death is its only harvest." The survivors recoiled.
Even fire, even ruin, that was part of the ritual.
But Elias was not finished. He turned to the others, his face streaked with soot. "Then we bury it deeper." "Deeper than fire."
"Deeper, only silence."
The Sullivan house fell that night, crushing everything within its cursed cellar. But some say the hymn never truly ended, that if you listen, on winter nights when the wind cuts through the trees, you can still hear the faint hum of 47 voices, waiting for the circle to be opened once again. When the dust settled, nothing remained but ruin. The Sullivan farmhouse was gone, buried under earth and fire. Its cellar collapsed into a tomb, and yet, some say the story did not end there. For 3 days, the townspeople dug at the smouldering wreck, desperate to know who, if anyone, had survived. They found little but blackened timbers, twisted beams, and stone cracked by heat. The Sullivan family was gone. So were the children. No bodies recognizable, only fragments of bone too small, too warped to identify. But amidst the ashes, one object was found, a ring of iron, perfectly circular,
fused into the foundation, unbroken, untouched by fire.
The townsfolk recoiled, whispering, "The circle remains." Reverend Alden, broken and grey-haired overnight, recorded the events in his journal, but the account was taken by church elders and sealed away.
Only fragments survive today,
copied in the margins of other texts, warnings, half-burned pages, lines written in shaking hands. One entry remains most infamous. "We buried the house, but not the song. The voices are waiting. The hymn does not die.
It only sleeps."
When word spread, local officials attempted to quell panic. The official report listed the Sullivan tragedy as an accidental fire. The children, if they were mentioned at all, were orphans or vagrants who had sought shelter in the basement and perished in the flames. But townsfolk knew better. They had heard the hymn, they had seen the shadows, they had watched neighbors vanish into the night, never to return, and still no authority dared to dig deeper. The site was left untouched.
A warning, unspoken but clear. Let the dead lie.
For decades, the field where the Sullivan house once stood lay barren. Crops refused to grow.
Animals avoided it.
Travelers swore the ground. The Sullivan name was struck from local records. Their descendants, if any, vanished or changed their surnames. Yet rumors spread further than Virginia. Folklorists in the 19th century wrote of the children of the circle. Even in Europe, whispers of American witchcraft found their way into journals, linking the Sullivan tragedy to older tales of sacrificial rites and impossible resurrections. The pattern always the same: a family, a circle, and children who did not stay children for long. Today, the ruins remain fenced off on private land. Locals refuse to trespass after dark. A few researchers, bold or reckless, have attempted to investigate, but their reports are short.
Often unfinished, ending mid-sentence.
One dated 1974 contains only these words before the typewriter ink smears into nothing.
The humming is not outside.
It is inside the skull.
Once you hear it, you cannot unhear it.
So what happened to the Sullivan children? Were they victims or vessels?
Was the basement their prison?
Or their chapel?
We may never know. 'Cause the house collapsed, yes.
But the circle, what had the circle endured? And if it is true what survivors claimed, then somewhere beneath Virginia soil,
47 voices still wait.
not asleep, not gone, merely paused, waiting for the song to begin again. You've just descended into one of America's darkest mysteries. But tell me, do you think the Sullivan children were victims? Or something far more sinister? Leave your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more stories like this, subscribe to Cold Mysteries, where history's secrets are never silent.
And the past is never truly buried.